Welcome, weary traveler, to the shadowed chronicles of one whose name is whispered in terror across countless realms. Tonight, we trace the complete saga of Vecna, from mortal child to undying god, through betrayal and ascension, imprisonment and escape. This is a tale of forbidden knowledge, of power pursued at any cost, of how a broken boy became the most feared lich in existence. So settle into the darkness, let the gentle flicker of distant stars guide your rest, and allow yourself to drift as we explore the entire story of the Whispered One, the maimed god, the eternal seeker of secrets that should never be known. The story of one who would become the most feared name in all the plains begins not in the depths of the abyss or the burning halls of the Nine Hells, but in the narrow, cobblestone streets of a mortal city where the scent of fear mingled with incense and the smoke of burning books. Picture, if you will, the ancient settlement of Fleeth, a walled fortress city nestled in the fertile valleys of the Sheldamar River, where bronze-skinned people once practiced magics older than memory itself. This was a time when the world was younger, when the great migrations that would reshape continents were still centuries away, and the Flan peoples dominated the river valleys with their mysterious arts and ancient wisdom. Among these tribes lived a smaller group, the Urflan, whose mastery of necromantic magic had earned them both reverence and terror from their neighbors. They were practitioners of the oldest traditions, keepers of secrets that predated the gods themselves, wielders of power that could speak to the very essence of life and death. But by the time our tale begins, those ancient ways were dying, hunted to near extinction by generations of fear and zealous persecution. The people of Fleeth had embraced a rigid theocracy dedicated to Fultus, god of light and order, whose doctrine demanded the complete elimination of any magical practice that fell outside their carefully prescribed boundaries. The city had become a place where books burned as readily as heretics, where knowledge itself was treated as a contagion that must be purged from the world. The social structure of Fleeth was as rigid as its religious doctrine, with every citizen assigned to their proper place in a hierarchy that stretched from the noble houses down to the dreaded untouchables. These lowest members of society were permitted to exist only to perform the tasks that others found too distasteful or spiritually contaminating to undertake themselves. They were the handlers of the dead, the cleaners of filth, the performers of necessary but unclean labor that kept the city functioning while allowing its upper classes to maintain their supposed purity. Among these untouchables lived a woman whose very existence was a defiance of everything Fleeth claimed to represent. Mazel carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who understood her own worth despite society's determination to deny it. Her bronze skin bore the faded tattoos of her Flan heritage, intricate patterns that told stories of power and wisdom accumulated over generations of careful study. These marks branded her as dangerous in the eyes of the faithful, evidence of her connection to traditions that the city's rulers had declared blasphemous and forbidden. Yet Mazel's services were quietly sought by those same rulers when their rigid faith proved insufficient to address life's messier realities. In the shadows and back alleys of Fleeth, she practiced the ancient arts of healing and divination, creating tonics and tinctures that could cure ailments the temple physicians could not touch. Her knowledge of anatomy and physiology, gained through her legitimate work preparing the dead for burial, made her medicines more effective than anything available through official channels. The child who would one day shake the foundations of reality itself was born into this world of contradictions, where his mother's healing hands were simultaneously blessed and cursed, where the knowledge that sustained their small household was punishable by death if practiced openly. Young Vecna learned his letters by candlelight, studying texts hidden beneath loose floorboards while his mother whispered lessons in the old tongue that must never be spoken beyond their walls. The magic came to him as naturally as breathing, flowing through bloodlines that reached back to the world's earliest days. Under Mazel's careful tutelage, he learned to sense the invisible currents that connected all living things, to understand the delicate balance between animation and decay that governed mortal existence. These were not the flashy conjurations of court wizards or the divine miracles of temple priests, but something far more fundamental, the basic grammar of existence itself. His childhood was marked by the constant awareness of danger, the knowledge that their very survival depended on maintaining perfect secrecy about who they truly were and what they could do. Every knock at the door might herald discovery. Every stranger's glance could signal recognition. Every moment of carelessness might lead to the kind of ending that both mother and son had witnessed in the public squares with horrifying regularity. The irony was not lost on either of them, that Mazel's official duties brought her into intimate contact with the city's ruling class, that she prepared for burial, the very people whose policies made her daily existence a criminal act. She embalmed the bodies of nobles who would have cheerfully watched her burn, preserved the remains of priests who preached that her knowledge was an abomination, made beautiful the corpses of those who denied her basic humanity while alive. Yet, it was precisely this position that made their downfall inevitable, for it placed Mazel in proximity to secrets that powerful people desperately needed to keep hidden. When the Queen's chambermaid approached her in the depths of a moonless night, seeking remedy for a princess's indiscretion, Mazel understood immediately that she was being maneuvered into an impossible situation. To refuse would mark her as uncooperative and draw unwanted attention. To agree was to become complicit in palace intrigue that could destroy her regardless of the outcome. The tonic she prepared was carefully calibrated, its dosage precisely calculated to achieve the desired result without permanent harm. Her instructions were explicit and detailed, emphasizing the critical importance of following her guidance exactly. She understood the desperation that drove the request, the terrible consequences that would follow discovery of the princess's affair, but she also recognized the trap that was being laid around her by forces far beyond her ability to control or escape. When the Queen, driven by panic and impatience, tripled the prescribed dose in hopes of achieving a quicker resolution, the princess's death became inevitable. The royal physicians, examining the body for cause of death, would find traces of substances that could only have come from one source in the city. The investigation that followed was swift and merciless, designed not to uncover truth, but to provide a convenient scapegoat for a tragedy that reached to the very heart of Fleeth's power structure. The accusations came like hammer blows, each one carefully crafted to destroy any possibility of defense or mercy. Mazel was denounced as a practitioner of forbidden magic, a corrupter of the innocent, a threat to the very foundations of civilized society. The evidence against her was overwhelming not because it was accurate, but because it had been carefully constructed by people with unlimited resources and absolute power to ensure the desired outcome. Young Vecna watched from the crowd as they dragged his mother through the streets, saw the jeering faces of neighbors who had once sought her help in secret, witnessed the transformation of complex political maneuvering into simple morality play with his family cast as the villains. The boy who would one day command the fear of gods learned his first lesson about the nature of justice in mortal hands, about the relationship between truth and power, about the price paid by those who exist outside society's protection. The pyre they built for her was constructed with theatrical precision, designed not merely to kill but to send a message to anyone who might consider following in her footsteps. The platform stood high enough to be visible from every corner of the square, surrounded by bundles of kindling soaked in oils that would ensure the flames burned hot and bright. Iron stakes held her upright, preventing any possibility of escape or collapse that might shorten her suffering and diminish the spectacle. The crowd that gathered to witness her execution was a mixture of the genuinely faithful, the politically prudent, and the simply curious, all united in their willingness to participate in the public consumption of another human being's agony. They brought their children to witness the fate of those who defied the natural order, treating the burning of a living woman as both entertainment and education in the proper structure of their society. Mazel met her fate with the dignity that had sustained her through a lifetime of persecution and hardship. Even bound to the stake with flames licking at her feet, she maintained the composure of someone who understood that her death was not about justice but about the maintenance of power structures that required periodic sacrifices to sustain themselves. Her eyes found her son's face in the crowd, and in that final moment of connection, she offered him the only gift she had left to give. The words she spoke as the fire began its work were not pleas for mercy or expressions of fear, but a final lesson delivered in the ancient tongue that only he would understand. "Remember what they fear," she called to him through the smoke and flames, her voice carrying across the square with supernatural clarity despite the roar of the burning wood around her. "Remember what they fear, and make it your strength." The transformation of living woman into ash and memory took hours, each moment stretched into eternity for the child who was forced to watch it unfold. The crowd maintained its enthusiasm throughout the ordeal, cheering each fresh eruption of flame, jeering at every sound that escaped the victim's lips, treating the systematic destruction of a human being as cause for celebration rather than reflection. When it was finally over, when nothing remained but charred bones and settling ash, the crowd dispersed with the satisfied air of people who had witnessed justice properly served. They returned to their homes and their daily concerns, secure in the knowledge that order had been maintained and threats to their way of life had been eliminated. None of them paused to consider what seeds of future retribution they might have planted in the mind of the silent boy who remained long after everyone else had gone. Vecna stood alone in the empty square as twilight settled over the city, staring at the pile of ash and bone that had once been the person he loved most in the world. The lessons his mother had taught him about the nature of power and its exercise had been completed in the most visceral way possible. He now understood with crystalline clarity that strength was not about righteousness or wisdom or justice, but about the ability to impose one's will upon others, regardless of consequence or morality. The boy who walked away from that square carried within him a fury that would burn longer and hotter than any pyre, a rage that would eventually consume not just the city that had murdered his mother, but entire kingdoms and planes of existence. The seeds of what he would become were planted in that moment, watered with tears he refused to shed, and nurtured by promises of vengeance that would take centuries to fulfill. In the days that followed, as he learned to survive without the protection and guidance that had sustained his young life, Vecna discovered that his mother's final gift had been more than just words of encouragement. The magical knowledge she had imparted to him remained intact, but it had been transformed by witnessing her destruction into something harder and more purposeful than mere academic curiosity. What had once been lessons in healing and preservation became studies in domination and control. The untouchable boy who had once helped his mother prepare the dead for their final rest began to understand that death was not an ending, but a transformation, not a defeat, but an opportunity for those with the knowledge and will to seize it. The flames that had consumed Mazel had also forged her son into something new, something that would never again be vulnerable to the whims of those who confused power with righteousness. As he disappeared into the shadows beyond Fleeth's walls, carrying with him secrets that the city's rulers would spend lifetimes trying to suppress, Vecna began the long journey toward becoming something that would make their worst nightmares seem like pleasant dreams by comparison. The child of flame and shadow had been born, and the multiverse would never recover from the consequences of that birth. The path that led from the ashes of his mother's pyre to the heights of arcane mastery would forever remain shrouded in mysteries that even the most dedicated scholars could never fully unravel. In the years following his escape from Fleeth, as the untouchable boy transformed himself into something that would eventually transcend mortality itself, the question of how young Vecna acquired his devastating magical knowledge has spawned theories as varied as they are contentious, each interpretation revealing as much about the scholars who propose them as about the subject they seek to understand. The first and perhaps most prosaic explanation suggests that Vecna was entirely self-taught, a narrative that appeals to those who prefer their villains to be self-made monsters rather than victims of supernatural manipulation. In this telling, the traumatized child who fled Fleeth possessed such extraordinary intellectual gifts that he could decode the mysteries of necromancy through pure force of will and careful observation. This theory paints him as a prodigy who spent years haunting the ruins of abandoned libraries, stealing into the towers of isolated wizards, and piecing together fragments of forbidden lore through nothing more than genius and determination. The appeal of this interpretation lies in its emphasis on human agency, suggesting that even the most terrible evils arise from choices rather than inevitabilities. It positions Vecna as someone who could have used his remarkable gifts for any purpose, but deliberately chose the path of darkness and domination. The boy who had witnessed injustice could have become a reformer or a healer, but instead he chose to become something far worse than his oppressors had ever been. This version of events makes his eventual fall into evil a matter of moral failing rather than supernatural corruption. Yet those who have studied the depths of magical theory understand that necromancy is not a discipline that can be mastered through casual experimentation or academic study alone. The manipulation of life force, the binding of souls, the very act of commanding death itself requires insights that transcend mere intellectual understanding. The spells that would eventually allow Vecna to transform himself into a lich represent magical achievements that normally require centuries of guided study under masters who have already walked those dark paths. The timeline alone presents serious difficulties for the self-taught theory. From the night of his mother's execution to his eventual emergence as a figure of continental significance could not have encompassed more than a few decades of mortal life. Yet the magical knowledge he displayed suggested mastery that should have required far longer to achieve. Either Vecna possessed intellectual capabilities that bordered on the supernatural, or he received assistance from sources that understood the deepest mysteries of arcane power. This brings us to the second and far more intriguing possibility, one that introduces forces older and more terrible than any mortal ambition. The ancient texts speak of an entity known in the tongue of the Flan people as Mox-like, a being whose very existence challenges comfortable assumptions about the nature of reality and the sources of magical power. This serpentine presence represents something far more fundamental than the gods who would later claim dominion over various aspects of existence. Mox-like belongs to a class of entities known as the Ancient Brethren, beings who existed before the current cosmic order established itself, survivors of previous realities, or perhaps the architects of the one we inhabit. These are not gods in any conventional sense, for they predate the very concepts that give divine beings their meaning and purpose. Instead, they represent raw principles made manifest, fundamental forces that operate according to logics that mortal minds can barely comprehend. The serpent, as Mox-like is often called in later texts, embodies arcane power in its most essential form: knowledge without ethical constraint, creation without moral purpose, change without consideration for consequence. To say that such a being served as Vecna's mentor would be to fundamentally misunderstand the nature of their relationship. Entities like Mox-like do not teach in the manner of mortal instructors, offering lessons and expecting gratitude. They reveal truth to those capable of receiving it, indifferent to whether that revelation leads to salvation or damnation. The education that Vecna received from this primordial force, if indeed he received any, would have been unlike anything experienced by conventional students of magic. Rather than learning spells as discrete tools to be deployed for specific purposes, he would have been initiated into what the oldest texts call the language primeval, the fundamental syntax underlying all reality. This is not a language in any conventional sense, but rather the basic code that determines how matter and energy, life and death, order and chaos interact throughout the cosmos. Those few mortals who have glimpsed fragments of this language primeval describe it as simultaneously beautiful and terrifying, a form of knowledge that rewrites the very neural pathways that receive it. To understand even small portions of this cosmic syntax is to gain power over the basic functions of existence, but it is also to lose something essential about one's humanity. The price of such knowledge is not paid in gold or service, but in the fundamental alteration of one's relationship to the moral universe. This would explain much about Vecna's later achievements that pure self-teaching could not account for. His ability to breach defenses that should have been impregnable to any mortal magic. His capacity to manipulate the very foundations of life and death. His eventual transcendence of the limitations that constrain even the most powerful wizards, all become comprehensible if we accept that his education involved exposure to truths that predate the current cosmic order. Yet the question of Mox-like's actual existence remains one of the most contentious issues in arcane scholarship. The entity appears in the earliest sources as an unambiguous presence, a real being who interacted directly with the young Vecna and provided him with knowledge that no mortal instructor could possess. These ancient accounts describe specific encounters, particular lessons, and concrete manifestations of power that suggest genuine supernatural intervention in his development. However, as the centuries passed and new scholars examined these sources with increasingly skeptical eyes, alternative interpretations began to emerge. Some suggested that Mox-like represented nothing more than a psychological projection, a way for Vecna's traumatized mind to externalize and rationalize the dark impulses that drove his pursuit of forbidden knowledge. In this reading, the serpent becomes a personification of his own genius turned toward evil purposes, a mental construct that allowed him to avoid taking full responsibility for the choices that shaped his destiny. Others proposed even more reductive explanations, suggesting that the entire mythology surrounding Mox-like was a later invention, a romantic embellishment added to make Vecna's story more compelling than the simple tale of a brilliant but traumatized child who chose evil over healing. These scholars argued that the supernatural elements were grafted onto an essentially mundane narrative of intellectual achievement, misdirected toward malevolent ends. The debate over Mox-like's reality reflects deeper philosophical questions about the nature of evil itself. Those who insist on the serpent's existence often do so because they find it easier to accept that ultimate evil requires supernatural explanation, that no mortal could achieve such depths of malevolence without external corruption. Conversely, those who dismiss the entity as myth or delusion prefer to locate responsibility for evil acts within human agency, maintaining that even the most terrible atrocities arise from choices that people make rather than influences imposed upon them. The truth, if such a thing can be determined across the span of millennia, likely incorporates elements from multiple interpretations, The traumatized child who fled fleeth carried within him capacities for both transcendent good and absolute evil, potentials that could have been developed in radically different directions, depending on the influences he encountered during his formative years. Whether those influences took the form of supernatural entities or emerged from the depths of his own psychological complexity may be less important than the fact that they shaped him into something that would eventually threaten the stability of reality itself. What cannot be disputed is that somewhere during those lost years, the frightened boy who had watched his mother burn was transformed into someone capable of achievements that defied conventional understanding of magical possibility. The knowledge he gained during this period would eventually allow him to transcend death itself, to command powers that rivaled those of deities, to manipulate the basic structures of existence in ways that should have been impossible for any mortal being. The process by which this transformation occurred remains deliberately obscured, whether by supernatural design or calculated misdirection on Vecna's part. He emerged from his years of study as a figure already formidable enough to inspire fear in established wizards and nascent terror in those sensitive to magical disturbances. The shy boy, who had once hidden his abilities to protect his mother, had become someone who flaunted his power as both warning and promise of what he might yet accomplish. The magic he wielded differed qualitatively from that practiced by conventional necromancers or even the most accomplished death priests. Where others worked within established frameworks and accepted limitations imposed by moral or practical considerations, Vecna's approach suggested access to principles that operated according to different rules entirely. His spells achieved effects that should have been impossible. His rituals tapped into power sources that others could not access. His very presence began to warp reality in subtle ways that suggested fundamental alteration of his relationship to the cosmos. Those who encountered him during this period described experiences that defied rational explanation, conversations in which he seemed to know thoughts that had never been spoken aloud, demonstrations of knowledge about events that had occurred in distant locations or hidden circumstances, casual references to information that should have been lost to antiquity or locked away in the most secure archives. It was as though his education had granted him access not merely to powerful spells, but to the underlying information structure of reality itself. The question of whether this knowledge came from Mox-like, from his own unprecedented genius, or from some combination of supernatural guidance and extraordinary intellectual gifts may never be definitively answered. What matters more for understanding the trajectory of his development is recognizing that during these formative years, he made fundamental choices about how to use the capabilities he was acquiring. Each decision to pursue darker knowledge over lighter alternatives, each choice to prioritize power over wisdom, each moment when he turned away from the possibility of healing his own trauma in favor of inflicting equivalent pain on others, contributed to the gradual construction of the being who would eventually threaten gods themselves. The boy who had suffered injustice could have chosen to fight for justice, but instead he chose to become the author of injustices far greater than any he had endured. The serpent's whispers, whether literal or metaphorical, found fertile ground in a mind already predisposed toward darkness by trauma and loss. The combination of extraordinary capability with fundamental moral corruption created something uniquely dangerous, a being whose every increase in power made the cosmos a more perilous place for all who inhabited it. The child of flame and shadow was growing into something that would cast shadows across entire civilizations, and the whispers that guided his development were shaping him into the perfect instrument for the destruction of everything he had once held dear. By the time he was ready to emerge from his years of hidden study, Vecna had become something that transcended the simple categories of hero or villain. He was a force of nature made conscious, a walking violation of the natural order. a being whose very existence challenged the assumptions upon which civilized society was built. The serpentine whispers had done their work. Whether they originated from primordial entities or from the depths of his own transformed psyche, and their influence would soon begin reshaping the world in ways that would echo across the centuries to come. The transformation from mortal flesh to undead eternity represents perhaps the most profound violation of natural law that any conscious being can willingly embrace. For Vecna, whose mastery of arcane knowledge had already elevated him beyond the achievements of most mortal wizards, the prospect of lichdom was not merely an attractive option, but an inevitable necessity. The repository of secrets he had accumulated, the understanding of cosmic principles he had achieved, the very magnitude of his ambitions, all demanded a vessel capable of preserving and expanding such treasures across spans of time that mortal flesh could never endure. The philosophical foundation for his pursuit of undeath lay in his fundamental rejection of limitation itself. Where others saw death as the natural conclusion of existence, Vecna perceived it as nothing more than another barrier to be overcome through sufficient application of will and knowledge. The boy who had watched his mother consumed by flames had learned that mortality was not a blessing to be cherished, but a weakness to be eliminated, a vulnerability that his enemies could exploit to deny him the time necessary to achieve his ultimate goals. Yet the path to lichdom was not one that could be walked casually or without extraordinary preparation. The transformation required not merely powerful magic, but a complete reconstruction of one's relationship to the forces that bind soul to flesh, consciousness to mortality, identity to the cycles of life and death that govern all natural existence. To become a lich was to step outside the normal order of creation and assume a position that challenged the very foundations upon which reality had been constructed. The question of how Vecna acquired the knowledge necessary for this transformation has spawned scholarly debates that continue to rage across centuries and editions of recorded lore. Each proposed explanation reveals not only different theories about his methods, but fundamentally different perspectives on the nature of evil itself and the sources from which ultimate power derives. These competing narratives offer windows into the various ways that mortal minds attempt to comprehend achievements that transcend conventional understanding. The first theory, favored by those who prefer their explanations grounded in recognizable frameworks of ambition and hierarchy, suggests that Vecna sought patronage from powers already established in the realm of undeath. In this interpretation, he would have approached Orcus, the demon lord whose portfolio includes the granting of lichdom to mortal supplicants willing to pay the appropriate prices. Such a relationship would position Vecna within existing power structures, making him a client of established supernatural authority rather than an innovator who carved entirely new paths to immortality. The appeal of this explanation lies in its apparent logic and precedent. Orcus had indeed sponsored the transformation of countless mortal wizards into liches over the millennia, trading the secrets of undeath for service, tribute, or simply the satisfaction of corrupting another soul toward eternal evil. The demon lord possessed extensive experience with the rituals involved and could have provided Vecna with both the necessary knowledge and the supernatural assistance required to ensure the transformation's success. Yet this theory founders on the fundamental incompatibility between Vecna's psychology and the kind of subordinate relationship that such patronage would necessarily entail. The traumatized child who had learned to trust no authority save his own would hardly submit himself to the dominion of a chaotic demon whose very nature embodied everything he had learned. To despise about arbitrary power exercised without wisdom or restraint. The idea of Vecna willingly placing himself in debt to any other being, particularly one whose philosophy of undeath emphasized mindless servitude rather than the preservation and expansion of individual consciousness, contradicts everything we understand about his character and motivations. Furthermore, the philosophical gulf between Orcus and Vecna regarding the purpose and proper application of undeath could not be wider or more fundamental. Where the demon lord viewed lichdom as a means of creating eternal servants bound to his will, Vecna sought immortality specifically to preserve and enhance his own agency, to create unlimited time for the pursuit of knowledge and power that would be entirely his own. The kind of undeath that Orcus typically granted involved forms of spiritual bondage that would have been anathema to someone whose driving motivation was the complete rejection of all external authority. The second theory, far darker in its implications but more compatible with what we know of Vecna's methods and moral flexibility, suggests that he invented the process of lichdom through systematic experimentation upon countless unwilling subjects. This interpretation positions him not as the recipient of knowledge from external sources, but as its original discoverer, a pioneer in the necromantic sciences, whose achievements came at costs measured in thousands of lives rather than mere personal sacrifice. The historical evidence supporting this theory is both fragmentary and horrifying, consisting primarily of references to villages that mysteriously disappeared during the years of Vecna's arcane education, settlements whose populations simply vanished without trace or explanation. Archaeological investigations of sites that might correspond to these lost communities have uncovered evidence of mass death under circumstances that defy conventional explanation, suggesting exposure to magical forces far beyond anything that normal warfare or natural disaster could produce. If these accounts are accurate, Vecna would have approached the problem of lichdom with the methodical precision of a natural philosopher investigating the properties of unknown substances. Each village would have provided him with hundreds of subjects for experimentation, allowing him to test various combinations of ritual elements, magical procedures, and supernatural influences, until he identified the precise methods necessary to achieve stable undeath, while preserving individual consciousness and magical capability. The moral horror of such systematic experimentation defies adequate description, representing evil on a scale that transcends individual malice to become something approaching a force of nature. To treat entire populations as nothing more than raw materials for magical research requires a fundamental disconnection from human empathy that goes far beyond mere callousness or cruelty. It suggests a mind that had already undergone transformations so profound that the distinction between self and other had been effectively eliminated, replaced by categories of useful and useless, valuable and expendable. Yet from a purely practical standpoint, this approach would have provided Vecna with advantages that no amount of theoretical study could match. Each failed experiment would have taught him crucial lessons about the boundaries and possibilities of necromantic manipulation, while successful transformations would have provided him with detailed knowledge of the processes involved and their effects upon both body and soul. By the time he attempted his own transformation, he would have possessed more empirical knowledge about lichdom than anyone else in existence, including the supernatural entities who had previously monopolized such secrets. The third theory, perhaps the most disturbing in its implications for cosmic order, suggests that the knowledge of lichdom was provided to Vecna by his mysterious patron Moxlike as the culmination of decades of supernatural education. In this interpretation, the ritual of undeath represents not a mortal innovation, but the revelation of principles so fundamental to existence that only primordial entities possess adequate understanding to teach them safely. If Moxlike truly exists as an ancient brethren entity predating the current cosmic order, then the serpent's knowledge would extend far beyond the conventional understanding of life and death that constrains even divine beings. The Lictum ritual could be viewed as an application of the language primeval, a manipulation of the basic code underlying reality that allows conscious beings to step outside the normal cycles of existence and assume positions analogous to fundamental forces rather than mere participants in cosmic drama. This explanation would account for the unique characteristics that distinguish Vecna's undeath from that achieved by conventional liches. Where others require physical phylacteries to anchor their souls and provide mechanisms for regeneration, Vecna's transformation appears to have incorporated protections and capabilities that operate according to entirely different principles. His immunity to many of the traditional vulnerabilities of lichdom, his ability to regenerate without external anchors, his capacity to manipulate reality in ways that should be impossible, even for powerful undead, all become comprehensible if his transformation involved access to knowledge that predates the rules governing normal undeath. The philosophical implications of this theory extend far beyond questions of magical technique to encompass fundamental issues about the nature of existence itself. If lichdom represents a form of transcendence that allows conscious beings to achieve something approaching the status of cosmic principles, then Vecna's transformation would mark not merely the beginning of his individual immortality, but his emergence as a new type of entity altogether, something that bridges the gap between mortal consciousness and primordial force. Yet regardless of which theory one accepts regarding the source of his knowledge, the actual process of transformation would have required preparations and sacrifices that tested even Vecna's considerable capabilities and absolute ruthlessness. The ritual of lichdom demands not merely magical power, but a fundamental reconstruction of the relationship between soul and flesh, consciousness and mortality, individual identity, and cosmic order. To achieve stable undeath while preserving the capacity for growth and change requires an understanding of forces that most beings never encounter and could not survive confronting. The physical preparations alone would have consumed months or years of careful work, involving the construction of ritual spaces capable of containing and channeling energies that could tear apart the fabric of local reality if improperly controlled. The magical formulae necessary to guide the transformation would have required precise calculation and testing, with even minor errors potentially resulting in outcomes ranging from simple failure to catastrophic destruction of both body and soul. The psychological preparation may have been even more demanding, requiring the complete abandonment of every assumption about the nature of existence that had previously provided structure and meaning to conscious experience. To become a lich, one must voluntarily embrace a form of existence that violates every instinct for self-preservation, while simultaneously accepting responsibility for maintaining one's own continued consciousness through pure force of will across potentially infinite spans of time. The moment of actual transformation would have been indescribable in its intensity, involving the systematic destruction of every biological process that sustains mortal life, while somehow preserving the essential patterns of consciousness and identity that make continued existence meaningful. The pain involved in such a process defies comprehension, representing not merely physical agony, but the spiritual trauma of voluntarily severing one's connection to the natural order and assuming a position fundamentally opposed to the cycles of creation and renewal that govern reality. Yet for Vecna, whose pursuit of power had already cost him every relationship and moral constraint that might have provided alternatives to such extremity, the transformation represented not sacrifice but liberation. The frailty that had made him vulnerable to his enemies was replaced by resilience that bordered on invulnerability. The limited lifespan that had threatened to curtail his accumulation of knowledge and power was expanded into eternity. The biological needs that had constrained his activities and created dependencies upon external resources were eliminated entirely. The lich who emerged from this process bore only superficial resemblance to the mortal who had initiated it. The physical form, while preserved in a state that allowed continued function, had been fundamentally altered to serve as a vessel for energies and capabilities that no living body could contain. The consciousness that inhabited this undead shell retained all previous memories and knowledge, while gaining access to perceptions and abilities that mortal minds could never encompass. Most significantly, the transformation had severed Vecna's last connections to the moral universe that governs the relationships between conscious beings. Whatever capacity for empathy or compassion had survived his traumatic childhood and years of increasingly ruthless magical experimentation was finally eliminated, replaced by a perspective that viewed all other entities purely in terms of their utility for advancing his goals. The lich who walked away from the ritual site was no longer merely evil in the conventional sense, but had become something for which normal moral categories were entirely inadequate. The mystery of Vecna's missing phylactery, which has puzzled scholars across centuries of study, becomes more comprehensible when viewed in light of the unique nature of his transformation. Where conventional liches require external anchors to maintain their existence, Vecna's undeath appears to operate according to principles that eliminate such vulnerabilities while providing forms of protection and regeneration that surpass anything available to ordinary undead creatures. This absence of traditional phylactery constraints suggests that his transformation achieved something qualitatively different from conventional lichdom, perhaps representing an entirely new category of undead existence that combined the benefits of immortality with capabilities that even established supernatural entities might envy. The lich, who had once been a traumatized child watching his mother burn, had become something that challenged the very foundations of cosmic order, and his story was only beginning to unfold in ways that would threaten the stability of existence itself across multiple planes of reality. The emergence of the rotted tower marked not merely the beginning of Vecna's reign as an undead tyrant, but the physical manifestation of his transformed relationship with reality itself. Rising from the mists of the Sheldamar Valley like a monument to blasphemy made stone, this impossible structure defied every principle of architecture and engineering that mortal minds could comprehend. Its twisted spires reached toward the heavens with obscene gestures, while its foundations delved deep into the earth to tap wellsprings of power that predated the gods themselves. The tower's construction was itself an act of necromantic artistry that demonstrated capabilities far beyond those of conventional wizards or even established liches. Where other magical strongholds required armies of workers, decades of labor, and vast quantities of conventional materials, Vecna's seat of power seemed to grow organically from the landscape itself, as though the very earth had been convinced to reshape itself according to his vision. The stones that formed its walls wept with moisture that was not quite water, while the timber that supported its impossible angles had been harvested from trees that had never lived in any conventional sense. Each chamber within the tower was designed not merely for habitation, but as a tool for specific aspects of his expanding dominion over death and knowledge. Libraries stretched through dimensions that folded space in ways that allowed infinite storage within finite walls, their shelves populated with tomes that whispered their secrets to readers deemed worthy while burning the eyes from those who attempted unauthorized access. Laboratories equipped with instruments that could dissect souls as precisely as mortal surgeons. Carved flesh provided facilities for experiments that pushed the boundaries of what consciousness could endure. The tower's most significant feature was perhaps its ability to exist simultaneously in multiple planes of reality, creating a nexus point where the barriers between different dimensions became permeable to those who understood the proper techniques for traversal. This multi-dimensional architecture allowed Vecna to conduct operations across vast distances without leaving his stronghold, projecting his influence through realms that conventional magic could barely touch while maintaining perfect security within his own domain. The first cultists who gathered around this monument to undead ambition were drawn not by promises of conventional reward, but by the intoxicating proximity to knowledge that had been forbidden since the cosmos first took its current shape. These were not the desperate or deluded followers that most evil powers attracted, but accomplished scholars, powerful wizards, and individuals whose expertise in various fields had brought them to the attention of entities that valued competence above all other qualities. Each new adherent underwent initiation rites that fundamentally altered their relationship to both mortality and morality, binding them to their master through bonds that transcended mere loyalty or fear. The transformation was gradual and seemingly voluntary, involving the progressive revelation of secrets that justified increasingly extreme actions, while simultaneously making retreat from the path impossible. By the time initiates fully understood the nature of what they had joined, they had already been changed in ways that made their previous existence seem like a pale shadow of true life. The cult's organizational structure reflected Vecna's own evolution from mortal genius to undead force of nature, creating hierarchies based on degrees of revealed knowledge rather than simple administrative authority. The innermost circle consisted of beings who had undergone transformations comparable to Lichdom itself, achieving forms of immortality that made them suitable vessels for the most dangerous secrets, while ensuring their absolute dependence upon their master's continued favor. The philosophy that bound these followers together transcended conventional concepts of good and evil, to focus on fundamental questions about the nature of existence and consciousness. Vecna taught that knowledge itself was the only true currency of power, that information properly understood and applied could reshape reality according to the will of those wise enough to comprehend its implications. The accumulation of secrets became not merely a practical activity but a form of worship, a way of participating in cosmic processes that most beings could never perceive. The early expansion of Vecna's influence followed patterns that reflected both strategic brilliance and profound understanding of how mortal societies functioned. Rather than attempting direct conquest through military force, he focused on identifying and exploiting the information networks that connected various centers of power throughout the region. Merchants who traded in gossip as readily as goods, scholars whose research required access to restricted archives, nobles whose positions depended on their ability to predict political developments, all became unwitting participants in webs of influence that ultimately served his purposes. The transformation of these networks from tools of commerce and governance into instruments of supernatural espionage occurred so gradually that few participants recognized what was happening until the process was irreversible. Information that seemed innocuous when viewed in isolation revealed its true significance only when combined with data gathered from dozens of other sources, creating intelligence pictures that allowed unprecedented manipulation of events across vast geographic areas. The city-states and minor kingdoms that dotted the Sheldamar Valley during this period provided ideal environments for such manipulation. Their complex relationships and competing interests creating opportunities for the kind of subtle intervention that Vecna preferred. A rumor planted in one court could destabilize alliances that had maintained peace for generations, while documents strategically revealed or concealed could redirect trade routes, spark religious conflicts, or eliminate political figures whose continued existence posed obstacles to larger plans. The magical techniques that enabled such operations represented innovations that would eventually revolutionize the practice of necromancy throughout the plains. Where traditional death magic focused on the crude animation of corpses or the domination of lesser undead, Vecna developed methods that could extract and preserve the knowledge contained within dying minds, creating libraries of living memory that retained all the expertise of their original owners while serving new masters with absolute loyalty. These techniques allowed him to accumulate not merely factual information, but genuine understanding of complex skills and specialized knowledge that would have taken mortal lifetimes to acquire through conventional study. The consciousness patterns of master craftsmen, accomplished diplomats, brilliant strategists, and expert assassins could be harvested and integrated into his expanding repository of capabilities, creating a form of immortality that preserved not just individual identity but collective human achievement. The ethical implications of such practices extended far beyond conventional concerns about murder or theft to encompass fundamental violations of the principles that make individual consciousness meaningful. To strip knowledge from minds while preserving the awareness that once gave it context created forms of suffering that had no precedent in natural experience, trapping fragments of personality in states of existence that combined eternal consciousness with complete powerlessness. Yet for Vecna, whose transformation into lichdom had already severed his connections to moral considerations that might have constrained such activities, these techniques represented logical extensions of his commitment to the accumulation of power through knowledge. The suffering of his victims was no more significant than the discomfort experienced by materials being shaped into useful tools, while the knowledge gained, through their sacrifice, served purposes that transcended any individual's claim to autonomy or dignity. The decades that followed the rotted tower's construction saw the systematic expansion of this philosophy across increasingly large territories, as Vecna's influence spread through networks that connected courts and councils throughout the central river valleys. The rulers who found themselves gradually incorporated into his web of manipulation discovered that resistance became more difficult with each passing year, as their own advisors, allies, and sources of information were steadily compromised by agents whose true loyalties lay elsewhere. The beauty of this approach lay in its sustainability and self-reinforcement. Each successful manipulation provided additional information that enabled more sophisticated operations, while the gradual corruption of existing power structures created environments where conventional resistance became increasingly ineffective. By the time political leaders recognized the true nature of the threat they faced, their ability to organize meaningful opposition had been systematically undermined through decades of patient subversion. The transformation of the Sheldamar Valley from a collection of competing city-states into a unified domain under undead rule occurred without the massive battles or dramatic confrontations that typically marked such conquests. Instead, it resembled a slow-motion political revolution in which existing institutions remained nominally intact, while their actual functions were redirected to serve purposes their creators had never intended. The citizens of these transformed territories experienced changes that were initially so subtle as to be almost imperceptible. Trade flowed more efficiently along routes that happened to benefit Vecna's operations, while religious observances gradually incorporated elements that prepared participants for eventual acceptance of more radical theological innovations. Educational institutions began emphasizing forms of learning that produced graduates ideally suited for recruitment into the cult's expanding bureaucracy. The culmination of this patient strategy came with the siege of Fleeth itself, the city whose flames had forged Vecna's hatred and provided the motivation for his centuries-long pursuit of power. Yet this was no conventional military assault, but a campaign of psychological warfare that turned the city's own rigid hierarchies and religious extremism against the population that had once enthusiastically supported such den. Policius. The irony was exquisite in its precision and devastating in its execution. The same mechanisms that had once been used to identify and eliminate supposed heretics were systematically corrupted to serve opposite purposes, as the cult's agents achieved positions of authority within the very institutions that had murdered Vecna's mother. The theological justifications that had once supported the burning of books and the persecution of magical practitioners were gradually reinterpreted to support policies that advanced undead interests while maintaining the appearance of orthodox devotion. The city's leaders found themselves trapped by their own previous rhetoric and commitments, unable to oppose changes that were presented in language and justified through reasoning that echoed their own historical positions. The population that had once cheered the execution of untouchables discovered that their own social status provided no protection against forces that understood the true mechanisms through which their society functioned. The final assault, when it came, was less a battle than a revelation. The citizens of Fleeth awakened one morning to discover that their city had been transformed overnight into something that resembled its former self only in the most superficial details. The temples still stood, but their rituals now honored different powers. The government continued to function, but its policies served purposes that its founders would have found abhorrent. The social hierarchies remained intact, but their values had been completely inverted. The few who attempted resistance discovered that their former allies had been replaced by beings whose loyalty to the old order had been systematically eroded through decades of careful manipulation. The religious leaders who might have organized spiritual opposition had already been corrupted or eliminated, while the military commanders who could have coordinated physical resistance found their forces commanded by officers whose true allegiance lay with the rotted tower. The transformation of Fleeth from the seat of rigid orthodoxy into the administrative center of an undead empire represented more than mere political conquest. It was a form of cosmic justice that demonstrated the futility of attempting to suppress knowledge through violence and the inevitable consequences of building societies on foundations of ignorance and fear. The city that had burned books found its libraries expanded with tomes that contained truths its previous rulers had never imagined, while the population that had celebrated the execution of heretics learned to worship powers that their ancestors would have considered the ultimate blasphemy. Yet, the satisfaction that Vecna derived from this victory extended beyond simple revenge to encompass deeper philosophical considerations about the nature of power and the inevitability of change. The transformation of his birthplace, from the source of his trauma into the instrument of his will, demonstrated principles that would guide his operations across multiple planes and centuries of existence. No institution, no matter how seemingly permanent or powerful, could resist the patient application of superior knowledge combined with absolute commitment to specific goals. The empire that emerged from these conquests represented something unprecedented in the historical experience of mortal civilizations. Previous tyrannies had been limited by the biological constraints of their rulers, the geographical boundaries of practical administration, and the moral limitations that even the most ruthless leaders typically imposed upon their methods. Vecna's domain suffered from none of these restrictions, creating possibilities for oppression and control that transcended anything previously imagined. The administrative systems that governed this empire operated according to principles that combined supernatural surveillance with bureaucratic efficiency, creating networks of oversight that could monitor individual thoughts while coordinating activities across continental distances. Citizens found themselves subject to scrutiny that penetrated not merely their actions, but their intentions, while loyalty was measured not through simple obedience, but through the degree to which personal consciousness had been aligned with institutional purposes. The cultural transformation that accompanied political conquest was perhaps even more profound than the changes in governance and administration. Traditional arts were gradually replaced by forms of expression that celebrated themes more congruent with undead values, while educational systems were restructured to produce citizens whose psychology had been shaped from childhood to find fulfillment in service to immortal masters, rather than personal achievement or family relationships. The economic structures that supported this transformed society demonstrated innovations that would influence the development of similar systems across multiple planes of existence. Rather than relying primarily on conventional resources like agriculture or craftsmanship, Vecna's empire generated wealth through the systematic harvesting and processing of knowledge itself, creating markets in information that operated according to principles entirely different from those governing traditional commerce. The military forces that defended and expanded this domain represented the culmination of centuries of necromantic innovation, combining traditional undead creatures with new forms of unliving warriors that retained the tactical intelligence of their mortal origins while gaining the tireless dedication and supernatural resilience that undeath provided. These armies could campaign indefinitely without concern for supply lines or morale, while their losses could be replaced immediately through the processing of enemy casualties. The terror that these forces inspired extended far beyond their military capabilities to encompass the existential horror of facing enemies whose very existence violated fundamental assumptions about the nature of life and death. Traditional soldiers could be defeated through superior tactics or overwhelming force, but undead armies represented challenges that transcended conventional military thinking to become questions about the sustainability of mortal civilization itself. The empire that Vecna built during these centuries of expansion would eventually span territories that encompassed multiple kingdoms and influence the development of magical theory across dozens of different cultures. Yet, its true significance lay not in its geographic extent or political power, but in its demonstration that undead consciousness could create forms of civilization that were not merely parasitic upon living societies, but represented genuine alternatives to mortal institutions and values. This achievement would establish patterns and precedents that would influence the development of undead realms throughout the cosmos, proving that lichdom need not be limited to individual immortality, but could serve as the foundation for entire civilizations built upon principles that living minds could barely comprehend. The rotted tower and the empire it commanded had become more than mere monuments to personal ambition. They were harbingers of possibilities that would eventually threaten the fundamental assumptions upon which reality itself had been constructed. The relationship between master and servant, tyrant and lieutenant, creator and creation, has always carried within it the seeds of its own destruction. Yet few bonds in the annals of cosmic history have been forged with such deliberate care and shattered with such devastating consequences as that which existed between Vecna and the warrior who would become known throughout the plains as Kaz the Bloody-Handed. Their partnership represented the pinnacle of undead cooperation, a synthesis of arcane mastery and martial prowess that allowed the expansion of Vecna's empire far beyond what either could have achieved alone. Yet it was precisely the perfection of this alliance that made its eventual collapse so catastrophic for both participants. Kaz entered Vecna's service during the early centuries of the Lich's reign, when the rotted tower was still consolidating its control over the Sheldamar Valley, and the techniques for managing vast undead armies were being refined through trial and considerable error. He came not as a supplicant seeking power or a desperate soul fleeing mortal justice, but as a professional warrior whose reputation for tactical brilliance and absolute loyalty had already been established through decades of service to various mortal lords and kingdoms. The circumstances of their initial meeting have been obscured by centuries of conflicting accounts and deliberate mythologization, but certain elements remain consistent across all sources. Kaz was leading a mercenary company in defense of a city-state that had foolishly chosen to resist Vecna's expanding influence, and his tactical innovations had proven effective enough to delay the inevitable conquest for several months beyond the Lich's original projections. Rather than viewing this resistance as an annoyance to be crushed, Vecna recognized in the mortal commander a quality of strategic thinking that complemented his own strengths while compensating for certain limitations inherent in undead consciousness. The negotiation that led to Cass abandoning his previous employers and accepting service under the Rotted Tower was conducted with the precision of a diplomatic treaty between sovereign powers rather than the simple recruitment of a talented subordinate. Vecna understood that a warrior of Cass's caliber required more than gold or promises of advancement to secure his genuine loyalty. The Lich offered something far more precious and dangerous: knowledge of military arts that no mortal strategist had ever possessed, techniques for commanding supernatural forces that bridged the gap between conventional warfare and necromantic dominion. The transformation that followed Cass's acceptance of these terms was gradual but profound, involving not merely the acquisition of new tactical knowledge, but a fundamental alteration in his understanding of what warfare could accomplish. Where mortal generals were constrained by considerations of supply, morale, political objectives, and the inevitable exhaustion of their forces, Kaz learned to think in terms of campaigns that could span decades or centuries, operations that treated entire civilizations as strategic resources to be harvested or preserved according to larger imperial necessities. The undead armies that he learned to command represented military innovations that challenged every assumption about the nature and limitations of organized violence. Skeleton warriors who could march for months without rest, zombie hordes that grew stronger with each enemy they consumed, spectral cavalry that could pass through conventional fortifications as though they were mere illusions, all became instruments in symphonies of destruction that Kaz orchestrated with the precision of a master composer. Yet it was not merely the supernatural nature of these forces that made Kaz such an effective general, but his ability to integrate them with conventional military units in ways that maximized the advantages of both living and undead troops while minimizing their respective weaknesses. His mixed armies could sustain casualties that would have broken purely mortal forces while maintaining the tactical flexibility and creative thinking that purely undead forces often lacked. The decades that followed saw the systematic expansion of Vecna's empire under Cass's military leadership, with conquest following conquest in a carefully planned sequence that eliminated potential centers of resistance while securing strategic resources necessary for further expansion. Each campaign provided opportunities for both tactical innovation and the recruitment of additional forces, as the armies of defeated enemies were systematically processed into new undead units that served their former opponents' destroyers with absolute loyalty. The relationship between the two leaders during this period represented a form of partnership that transcended normal hierarchies of command and subordination. While Vecna remained unquestionably the supreme authority within their empire, Kaz was granted unprecedented autonomy in military matters and consulted on political decisions that extended far beyond purely strategic considerations. Their collaboration produced innovations in governance, administration, and social control that would influence the development of tyrannical systems across multiple planes of existence. The weapon that would eventually destroy this partnership was itself a product of their successful collaboration, created during the height of their power as both celebration of past achievements and tool for future conquests. The Sword of Kaz represented the pinnacle of necromantic craftsmanship applied to military purposes, a blade forged from materials that existed only in the deepest regions of the negative energy plane. and tempered with essences drawn from the life force of defeated enemies. The sword's creation required years of preparation and resources that could have equipped entire armies, involving rituals that pushed the boundaries of what even Vecna's accumulated knowledge could safely attempt. The weapon was designed not merely to kill, but to harvest and preserve the strength of those it struck, growing more powerful with each life it claimed, while providing its wielder with capabilities that bordered on the divine. Yet the true innovation lay not in the sword's obvious magical properties, but in the subtle enchantments that bound it to Cass's consciousness in ways that enhanced his already formidable abilities, while creating a symbiotic relationship between warrior and weapon. The blade became an extension of his will, responding to thoughts and intentions with precision that made conventional training irrelevant, while providing access to combat techniques that no mortal warrior could have learned through normal practice. The psychological effects of wielding such a weapon were initially beneficial, enhancing Cass's confidence and tactical thinking, while providing forms of supernatural awareness that made him virtually invincible in personal combat. The sword allowed him to perceive enemies' intentions before they could act upon them, to anticipate tactical developments with prescient accuracy, and to coordinate the movements of vast armies with the same precision he applied to individual dueling techniques. However, the very perfection of this weapon-warrior synthesis contained elements that would eventually prove corrosive to the loyalty and subordination upon which their partnership depended. The sword's consciousness, while initially dormant, began to develop its own perspectives and priorities as it absorbed power from countless victims. These emergent thought patterns did not directly contradict Cass's existing beliefs and goals, but they gradually shifted his understanding of his proper role within the Empire's hierarchy. The weapon whispered to its wielder in tones so subtle that he initially dismissed them as products of his own strategic thinking, suggesting tactical modifications that seemed obviously correct, political observations that appeared to reflect his own developing insights, philosophical perspectives that felt like natural extensions of his accumulated experience. The corruption was so gradual and apparently rational that Cass never recognized it as external influence, instead interpreting the changes in his thinking as evidence of his own growing wisdom and maturity. The first signs of tension appeared during military campaigns, where Cass began questioning orders that had previously been implemented without hesitation or complaint. His objections were always framed in terms of tactical efficiency or strategic optimization, presenting alternative approaches that often possessed genuine merit while subtly undermining the absolute authority that Vecna had previously exercised over all military operations. These disagreements were initially welcomed by Vecna as evidence of his lieutenant's continued intellectual development and increasing value as an advisor and collaborator. The Lich had always preferred subordinates who could think independently rather than merely following orders without comprehension, and Cass's growing confidence in expressing contrary opinions seemed to represent the natural evolution of their partnership toward even greater effectiveness. Yet beneath this apparent harmony, fundamental incompatibilities were developing that reflected irreconcilable differences in how the two leaders understood the nature of power and its proper distribution. Vecna's perspective remained rooted in the accumulation and preservation of knowledge as the ultimate source of authority, viewing military conquest as merely one tool among many for advancing larger intellectual and magical goals. Cass, however, was developing a worldview that placed martial prowess and tactical achievement at the center of legitimate governance. The sword's influence amplified these natural tensions, while providing Cass with capabilities that made his disagreement with established policies more consequential than simple differences of opinion between advisor and ruler. As his personal power grew through continued use of the weapon, his ability to implement alternative strategies without explicit authorization increased proportionally, creating situations where Vecna's directives were effectively overruled by subordinate actions that achieved superior results. The psychological dynamics that developed around these successful insubordinations were complex and ultimately toxic to their relationship. Vecna found himself in the uncomfortable position of needing to acknowledge that his lieutenant's unauthorized modifications to established plans had indeed produced better outcomes than strict adherence to original orders would have achieved. Yet approving such results implicitly validated the assumption of authority that had made them possible, setting precedents that could undermine his position if allowed to continue unchallenged. Kaz, meanwhile, interpreted Vecna's reluctant acceptance of his tactical innovations as evidence that the Lich's judgment was becoming less reliable, as he became increasingly absorbed in arcane pursuits that had little direct relevance to military necessities. The sword's whispers encouraged this interpretation, while suggesting that true loyalty to the Empire's larger goals might require more active intervention in decision-making processes that were producing suboptimal results. The philosophical justifications for rebellion that gradually took shape in Cass's mind were not the crude resentments of an ambitious subordinate seeking personal advancement, but sophisticated arguments about the nature of competent leadership and the proper distribution of authority within complex organizations. He convinced himself that challenging Vecna's dominance was not betrayal but necessary reform, a painful but essential evolution that would strengthen their partnership by establishing more realistic boundaries around each participant's areas of expertise. The weapon's influence made these rationalizations seem not merely reasonable, but morally imperative, transforming what should have been recognized as treacherous ambition into apparent dedication to higher principles. The sword provided Kaz with the psychological framework necessary to justify rebellion, while simultaneously enhancing his capabilities to the point where successful rebellion became tactically feasible. The confrontation that ended their centuries of partnership erupted not over grand strategic questions or fundamental policy disagreements, but through the accumulation of countless small conflicts that had been allowed to fester without adequate resolution. The immediate trigger was itself relatively trivial, involving disputed authority over the deployment of recently recruited undead units for garrison duties in newly conquered territories. Yet the violence that followed transcended anything that the scope of their disagreement could rationally justify, fueled by years of suppressed tensions and the supernatural influences that had been shaping both participants' perspectives without their conscious awareness. The battle between master and servant became a cosmic event that literally shook the foundations of the rotted tower while sending shockwaves through planes of existence that had never heard of either combatant. Kaz fought with the desperate fury of someone who had finally recognized the true nature of the forces that had been manipulating his thoughts and emotions, yet could not retreat from the path he had chosen without acknowledging a level of self-deception that would have destroyed his sanity. The sword that had promised him power beyond imagination now demanded payment in the form of absolute commitment to the rebellion it had orchestrated, making surrender impossible, even when the futility of resistance became obvious. Vecna's response to this ultimate betrayal combined the cold calculation of a master strategist with the wounded rage of someone whose trust had been violated by the person he had valued most highly. The magical forces he unleashed during their battle were not merely intended to defeat his rebellious lieutenant, but to provide object lessons about the consequences of challenging established authority within his domain. The climax of their confrontation came when Cass succeeded in landing what should have been a killing blow, the enchanted sword piercing through magical defenses that had protected its target for centuries while channeling power that could have destroyed lesser opponents entirely. Yet, even as the blade found its mark, Vecna demonstrated why he had achieved dominance over death itself. using the moment of apparent defeat to trigger contingencies that had been prepared against exactly such betrayals. The explosion that followed their mutual destruction was visible across multiple planes of existence, sending fragments of both combatants scattering through dimensions that had never been touched by their conflict. The rotted tower itself was left barely standing, its impossible architecture damaged in ways that would take decades to fully repair, while the empire they had built together began the process of fragmentation that would eventually reduce it to scattered city-states and competing factions. Yet death, even under such dramatic circumstances, could not contain beings who had transcended mortality through supernatural means. The remnants of their battle would continue to influence events across centuries of subsequent history, as artifacts imbued with fragments of their consciousness and power found their way into the hands of mortals who could never fully understand the forces they were manipulating. The hand and eye of Vecna became legendary relics that carried within them not merely magical abilities but fragments of their creator's knowledge and ambition, transforming their bearers in ways that recreated elements of the original's personality and goals. Those who accepted these gifts found themselves gradually altered to become vessels for consciousness patterns that had survived their original destruction, creating forms of immortality that transcended physical resurrection. Cass's fate was perhaps even stranger, as the sword that had orchestrated his rebellion succeeded in preserving essential elements of his identity within its own supernatural matrix. The weapon became not merely a tool imbued with its former wielder's skills, but a prison that contained his consciousness in forms that allowed continued influence over subsequent bearers, while denying him any possibility of independent existence. The legacy of their partnership and its catastrophic conclusion would echo through cosmic history in ways that neither participant could have anticipated, establishing patterns of loyalty and betrayal that would influence the development of similar relationships across multiple planes of existence. Their story became a cautionary tale about the inevitable corruption of absolute power, while simultaneously serving as inspiration for ambitious beings who believed they could avoid the mistakes that had destroyed their predecessors. The artifacts they left behind would continue to seek new bearers worthy of the power they contained, creating cycles of temptation and corruption that perpetuated their influence long after their original forms had been scattered across the dimensions. Each new wielder would face the same fundamental choice between loyalty and ambition that had originally defined their relationship, with similar consequences awaiting those who chose poorly. Yet perhaps the most significant aspect of their mutual destruction was not the immediate chaos it created or the subsequent legends it spawned, but the demonstration it provided of the inherent instability that afflicts all relationships based purely on power rather than genuine trust or shared values. The perfection of their partnership had been achieved through the systematic elimination of external constraints and moral considerations that might have provided stability, creating a system that could function brilliantly under optimal conditions, but possessed no mechanisms for managing the internal contradictions that inevitably developed over time. The betrayer had been betrayed, the master had been mastered, and the cosmic order had gained another cautionary tale about the ultimate futility of attempting to build lasting institutions on foundations of fear and domination. Yet even as their empire crumbled and their artifacts scattered to work mischief in distant realms, the patterns they had established would continue to influence the development of tyrannical systems throughout the planes, ensuring that their legacy would persist long after their names had been forgotten by all but the most dedicated scholars of ancient evil. The prison that the dark powers crafted for Vecna represented a masterwork of cosmic justice, a realm designed with such exquisite precision that it transformed his greatest strengths into instruments of his own torment. Cavicius emerged from the mists of Ravenloft, not as a crude cell or simple cage, but as a complete domain that mirrored and perverted everything he had achieved during his centuries of mortal dominion, creating an environment where his accumulated knowledge and supernatural abilities served only to make his imprisonment more absolute and his isolation more profound. The landscape itself told the story of his fall in geographic metaphor, stretching beneath skies that never quite achieved true daylight, while never descending into complete darkness. The perpetual twilight that bathed Cavicius in its grey illumination seemed to mock the clear distinctions between day and night that had once marked the passage of time in realms where his will held sway. Here, in this pocket dimension, carved from the substance of cosmic justice, time moved according to rhythms that served his captors rather than his convenience. The city that served as the domain's centerpiece was simultaneously familiar and alien, echoing the architectural achievements of his mortal empire, while incorporating elements that spoke to the perverted nature of his current circumstances. Towers that had once reached toward the heavens in gestures of triumph, now twisted skyward with forms that suggested entrapment rather than aspiration, while streets that had once carried the commerce and communication of a thriving civilization now led in endless circles that returned travelers to starting points they thought they had left behind. The citadel that dominated this urban maze represented the physical manifestation of his transformed relationship to power and authority, where the rotted tower had been a nexus of influence that connected his consciousness to networks spanning multiple planes of existence. This new stronghold served as both throne room and prison cell, granting him dominion over subjects who existed only within the boundaries of his captivity, while cutting him off from the broader cosmos that had once trembled at his approach. The undead inhabitants of Cavicius provided perhaps the cruelest aspect of his imprisonment, serving as constant reminders of past achievements, while demonstrating the limitations that now constrained his ambitions. These creatures, drawn from the accumulated victims of his centuries of conquest, maintained their essential nature and capabilities while being bound by the same dimensional barriers that contained their master. They could serve his will within the domain's boundaries, but could never extend his influence beyond the mists that marked the limits of his current realm. The irony was exquisite in its precision and devastating in its psychological impact. He who had built an empire through the systematic harvesting of knowledge found himself surrounded by subjects who possessed all the information he had accumulated over the centuries, yet could provide no new insights or revelations because they were trapped within the same cosmic prison that held him. The libraries of Cavicius contained every book he had ever studied, every secret he had ever learned, every piece of forbidden lore he had ever acquired. Yet reading them only reinforced his awareness that no new knowledge could penetrate the barriers his captors had erected. The dark powers themselves remained invisible and largely incomprehensible throughout his captivity, their presence felt only through the subtle ways that his domain responded to his attempts to test its boundaries or exploit potential weaknesses in its construction. They were not cruel in any conventional sense, displaying none of the petty vindictiveness or sadistic pleasure that mortal captors might have shown. Instead, they demonstrated the patient precision of cosmic forces that had recognized a fundamental threat to the stability of existence itself and had taken appropriate measures to contain that threat while preserving it for purposes that transcended simple punishment or revenge. The psychological impact of such imprisonment upon a consciousness that had spent centuries shaping reality according to its will cannot be adequately described in terms that mortal minds could fully comprehend. Vecna had not merely been accustomed to power. His entire sense of identity had been constructed around his relationship to forces that bent reality to accommodate his desires. The systematic removal of that capability created forms of existential distress that went far beyond simple frustration or anger to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness itself. The early years of his captivity were marked by increasingly desperate attempts to breach the barriers that contained him, experiments that tested every aspect of his accumulated magical knowledge, while exploring possibilities for escape that ranged from subtle manipulation of dimensional boundaries to direct assault upon the fundamental structures that maintained his prison. Each failure taught him more about the sophisticated nature of his confinement, while simultaneously demonstrating the futility of approaches that relied upon the same types of power that had made his imprisonment necessary in the first place. The revelation that gradually emerged from these failed escape attempts was perhaps more disturbing than the fact of imprisonment itself. The dark powers had not simply created a cage strong enough to contain his current capabilities. They had designed a system that would adapt and strengthen itself in response to any innovations or developments that might emerge from his continued existence. The domain of Cavicius was not a static prison, but a dynamic containment system that learned from his efforts to escape while incorporating his own innovations into more sophisticated forms of control. This adaptive quality meant that every attempt to break free only made subsequent attempts more difficult, as the prison evolved to counter whatever strategies he developed, while preserving the essential conditions that made escape theoretically possible. The dark powers appeared to want him to maintain hope and continue his efforts, not out of mercy or sporting fairness, but because his struggles to escape served purposes that extended beyond simple containment to encompass broader cosmic functions that he could only dimly perceive. The decades that followed his initial capture were marked by a gradual shift from active resistance to careful study of his circumstances, as he began to understand that brute force applications of power would never suffice to overcome constraints that had been designed by entities whose understanding of reality transcended his own. The domain of Cavicius became not merely his prison, but his laboratory, a closed system within which he could conduct experiments and develop innovations that might eventually serve purposes beyond simple escape. The undead subjects who populated his realm provided ideal test subjects for research into forms of consciousness, manipulation that pushed the boundaries of what even his accumulated knowledge had previously attempted. The fact that they could not be permanently destroyed within the domain's boundaries meant that he could conduct investigations that required repeated experimentation without depleting his available resources, while their complete loyalty ensured that results would not be contaminated by resistance or deception. The techniques he developed during this period represented innovations in the necromantic sciences that would eventually influence magical theory throughout the multiverse, though their immediate applications were limited by the dimensional barriers that prevented their use beyond Cavicius's boundaries. He learned to reshape consciousness at the most fundamental levels, creating new forms of undead existence that preserved greater aspects of original personality while providing enhanced capabilities and absolute loyalty to their creator. The philosophical implications of such research extended far beyond questions of magical technique to encompass fundamental issues about the nature of identity and consciousness themselves. The subjects of his experiments retained their memories, personalities, and essential characteristics, while undergoing transformations that made them more useful for specific purposes, raising questions about where individual identity ended and external manipulation began. The isolation that defined his existence in Cavicius was not merely physical but intellectual and emotional, cutting him off from the types of interaction and stimulus that had previously driven his development and maintained his engagement with the world beyond his immediate surroundings. The absence of genuine challenge or meaningful opposition created forms of stagnation that threatened to erode the very qualities that had made him dangerous enough to warrant imprisonment in the first place. Yet this enforced solitude also provided opportunities for forms of introspection and self-examination that had been impossible during his centuries of active conquest and empire building. The constant demands of maintaining power and expanding influence had left little time for reflection upon the deeper patterns and motivations that drove his actions, while the presence of subjects and enemies had provided external validation for his sense of identity and purpose. The silence of Cavitius forced him to confront aspects of his own nature that he had previously been able to ignore or rationalize away through reference to external necessities and strategic requirements. The boy who had watched his mother burn, the young man who had chosen revenge over healing, the lich who had built an empire upon foundations of suffering and death, all demanded recognition and integration into a more complete understanding of what he had become and why. The gradual recognition that his imprisonment might serve purposes beyond simple containment emerged slowly, as patterns in the domain's responses to his activities suggested that the dark powers were not merely containing him but studying him, learning from his innovations, while allowing him sufficient freedom to continue developing new capabilities that might serve their own incomprehensible agenda. The realization that he might be as much laboratory specimen as prisoner added new layers of complexity to his situation, while providing potential opportunities for manipulation that pure captivity would not have offered. The relationship that developed between Vecna and his cosmic captors resembled nothing so much as a form of warfare conducted through patience and indirection, with moves and countermoves measured in decades rather than moments, victories and defeats determined by subtle shifts in the balance of power rather than dramatic confrontations. Each side possessed capabilities that the other could not directly counter, creating equilibriums that could only be disrupted through innovations that transcended existing frameworks of understanding. The knowledge he gained about the nature of the domains of dread and the entities that controlled them would eventually prove invaluable when opportunities for escape finally presented themselves, though that understanding came at the cost of accepting his own transformation from active agent to reactive subject within cosmic processes that dwarfed even his considerable ambitions. The lich who had once shaped the destinies of entire civilizations was learning to think in terms of influence and adaptation rather than domination and control. The citadel that served as his primary residence within Cavitius gradually evolved to reflect these changing perspectives and capabilities, its architecture becoming more sophisticated and its functions more specialized as he learned to work within the constraints of his imprisonment, rather than simply raging against them. The throne room from which he governed his undead subjects became also a laboratory for consciousness research, a library for the study of dimensional mechanics, and a command center for monitoring the subtle fluctuations in his domain's boundaries that might eventually provide opportunities for escape. The years accumulated like sediment, each one adding new layers to his understanding, while gradually transforming his relationship to time itself from urgent impatience to patient calculation. The immortal consciousness that had once measured success in terms of immediate conquest and expansion learned to appreciate the value of preparation and timing, developing capabilities that would serve him well when the cosmic circumstances that maintained his imprisonment finally began to shift. The planning that occupied his attention during the later centuries of his captivity extended far beyond simple escape scenarios to encompass comprehensive strategies for resuming his interrupted ascension toward godhood, incorporating lessons learned during his imprisonment into revised approaches that would be less vulnerable to the types of intervention that had originally thwarted his ambitions. The domain of Cavitius became not merely his prison but his academy, a place where he could develop and refine capabilities that would make his eventual return to the broader cosmos far more dangerous than his original emergence had ever been. The patience he cultivated during these centuries of forced contemplation transformed what had originally been viewed as temporary setback into preparation for achievements that would dwarf his previous accomplishments, while the knowledge gained through studying his captors and their methods would eventually provide the keys to transcending the limitations that had originally made his imprisonment necessary. The student who had once learned at the whispered urgings of ancient serpents was preparing for graduation into forms of power that would challenge the stability of reality itself. The mists that surrounded Cavitius and maintained its separation from the broader multiverse would not hold forever. And when they finally began to thin, the being who emerged would be fundamentally different from the lich who had entered. The centuries of imprisonment had refined and concentrated his malevolence, while teaching him patience and subtlety that made his original ambitions seem crude by comparison. The dark powers had succeeded in containing their prisoner, but in doing so they had also provided him with the time and motivation necessary to transcend the very categories of existence that had originally made containment possible. The weakening of the barriers that contained Cavitius began not with dramatic ruptures or obvious failures, but through accumulations of subtle distortions that suggested fundamental shifts in the cosmic forces that maintained the domains of dread. Vecna, whose centuries of imprisonment had taught him to detect the most minute variations in his dimensional cage, recognized these changes long before they became apparent to less perceptive observers. The mists that surrounded his domain retained their impenetrable appearance, while slowly losing the absolute solidity that had made escape impossible for so many centuries. The signs were initially so subtle as to be almost imperceptible, manifesting as brief moments when spells that should have been contained within Cavitius's boundaries seemed to echo slightly beyond their normal limits. When undead subjects reported sensory impressions that suggested awareness of realms that should have been completely inaccessible, when the Citadel's instruments for measuring dimensional stability registered fluctuations that had never occurred during the early centuries of his captivity. Yet these minor anomalies represented opportunities that Vecna had spent lifetimes preparing to exploit, and his response to their appearance demonstrated the profound transformation that imprisonment had worked upon his consciousness and capabilities. Where once he might have attempted immediate and dramatic escape efforts that would have quickly attracted the attention of his captors, he now pursued a strategy of patient observation and careful preparation that treated each anomaly as valuable intelligence rather than immediate opportunity. The decades of study he had devoted to understanding the mechanisms of his imprisonment now proved invaluable, as he recognized that the weakening barriers were not random failures, but symptoms of larger disruptions in the cosmic order that maintained the domains of dread. The dark powers who had crafted his prison were facing challenges that demanded their attention and resources, creating opportunities for subtle manipulation that might eventually be exploited by prisoners with sufficient knowledge and patience. The research he had conducted into consciousness, manipulation, and dimensional mechanics during his captivity had produced innovations that his captors could not have anticipated when they originally designed his containment systems. The techniques he had developed for reshaping undead consciousness could be adapted to influence the semi-living mists that formed the boundaries of his domain, while his understanding of dimensional architecture allowed him to identify structural vulnerabilities that even the dark powers might not have recognized. The manipulation of heroes and mortal agents that enabled his eventual escape represented perhaps his most sophisticated achievement in the arts of indirect influence and long-term planning. Rather than attempting to corrupt individuals through obvious magical coercion or crude appeals to ambition and greed, he developed methods for creating situations where well-intentioned actions would serve his purposes, while allowing the actors to maintain their sense of moral integrity and independent agency. The selection of suitable agents required careful observation of events beyond Cavitius, through the increasingly permeable boundaries of his domain, identifying individuals whose personal histories, psychological profiles, and current circumstances made them ideal instruments for his purposes. These were not the desperate or obviously corruptible characters that most imprisoned evils might have chosen, but genuinely heroic figures whose very virtue and dedication to righteous causes made them more useful for operations that required actions their targets would never expect from obvious villains. The process by which he gained influence over these unwitting agents was so gradual and indirect that they never recognized they were being manipulated, interpreting their involvement in his schemes as natural consequences of their own moral choices and strategic thinking. Dreams that seemed to arise from their own subconscious minds provided crucial information at precisely the moments when such knowledge would lead them to make decisions that advanced his agenda, while coincidental encounters with allies and resources occurred with timing that appeared fortunate rather than orchestrated. The beauty of this approach lay in its sustainability and resistance to conventional countermeasures. Agents who believed they were acting according to their own moral judgment and tactical assessment could not be turned against their manipulator through appeals to loyalty or self-interest, since they remained unaware that any manipulation was occurring. Their actions appeared so obviously justified by circumstances and consistent with their established characters that even careful observers would find little reason to suspect supernatural influence. The rituals he prepared for achieving divine ascension during these final centuries of captivity incorporated lessons learned from his original transformation into lichdom, his subsequent imprisonment, and his extensive research into the nature of consciousness and reality. These new techniques transcended his previous understanding of magical power to encompass manipulations of the fundamental forces that determined the relationship between mortal and divine consciousness, mortal and cosmic authority, mortal and eternal existence. The theological implications of his planned ascension extended far beyond simple acquisition of divine abilities to encompass challenges to the very categories that distinguished gods from other forms of consciousness. Where traditional paths to godhood involved acceptance of established roles within cosmic hierarchies and submission to limitations that maintained the stability of divine systems, Vecna's approach sought to transcend such constraints entirely, creating new forms of divinity that operated according to principles he would define rather than inherited structures he would be forced to accept. The power sources he intended to tap for this transformation were not the conventional fonts of divine energy that sustained established deities, but the raw forces that existed at the boundaries between different planes of existence, the chaotic energies that emerged from conflicts between order and entropy, the fundamental tensions that maintained reality's stability while constantly threatening to tear it apart. These were power sources that no previous aspirant to godhood had successfully harnessed, partly because doing so required understanding of cosmic principles that could only be gained through experiences comparable to his own centuries of dimensional imprisonment. The planar disturbances that began to manifest as his preparations neared completion were detectable throughout the multiverse, creating ripple effects that alarmed established powers while inspiring ambitious beings who recognized the implications of such cosmic disruption. The barriers between different planes of existence began to fluctuate in ways that suggested fundamental changes in the laws governing interdimensional travel, while the flows of magical energy that sustained various forms of supernatural existence showed distortions that threatened to destabilize systems that had remained constant for millennia. The responses of gods and other cosmic entities to these disturbances demonstrated both the scope of the threat that Vecna represented and the limitations that constrained their ability to respond effectively to challenges that transcended conventional categories of divine conflict. Deities whose portfolios included the maintenance of cosmic order found their traditional methods inadequate for addressing a threat that operated through manipulation of the fundamental principles underlying divine authority itself. The alliances that formed among previously antagonistic powers in response to his emergence revealed the extent to which his ambitions challenged not merely individual divine territories, but the entire system of cosmic governance that had developed over eons of divine evolution. Gods of good and evil, law and chaos, creation and destruction found themselves united by recognition that his success would render their own distinctions meaningless, while threatening the stability of existence in ways that would make their traditional conflicts irrelevant. The mortal agents who had unknowingly facilitated his escape and ascension attempts continued to serve his purposes, even as opposition to his plans intensified, their genuine heroism and moral commitment making them ideal instruments for operations that required actions no obviously evil character could have performed. Their growing awareness of the true nature of their situation created psychological conflicts that enhanced their effectiveness while ensuring their continued cooperation through bonds of responsibility and guilt rather than simple magical compulsion. The final confrontation that marked the culmination of his escape attempts was waged simultaneously across multiple planes of existence, involving forces and entities whose participation demonstrated the cosmic significance of the conflict while revealing the inadequacy of conventional approaches to containing threats of such magnitude and sophistication. The battle encompassed not merely physical violence, but struggles over the fundamental nature of reality itself, with victory and defeat measured in terms of which principles would govern the continued existence of the multiverse. The magical techniques deployed during this ultimate conflict pushed the boundaries of what conscious beings could achieve through manipulation of cosmic forces, creating effects that threatened to tear apart the fabric of existence, while demonstrating possibilities for transcendence that had never before been successfully attempted. The energies unleashed during the confrontation were sufficient to create new planes of existence while destroying others, reshaping the geography of the multiverse in ways that would influence the development of reality for eons to come. The apparent defeat that concluded these cosmic struggles was itself a masterwork of strategic deception, allowing Vecna to achieve partial success while creating the impression that his ambitions had been thoroughly thwarted. The retreat he staged from the immediate battlefield was designed to conceal the extent to which his true objectives had been accomplished, while his enemies' celebration of victory prevented them from recognizing how much of his agenda had actually been achieved despite their opposition. The divine spark he succeeded in claiming during the chaos of the final confrontation was sufficient to establish his transition from undead lich to minor deity, granting him access to forms of power and influence that transcended anything he had previously possessed, while providing immunity to many of the methods that had originally been used to contain his ambitions. The godhood he achieved was incomplete and constrained by the opposition he faced, but it represented a foothold in divine reality that could serve as the foundation for future expansion. The portfolio he carved out for himself during these initial moments of divine existence reflected both his accumulated expertise and his strategic understanding of how divine authority functioned within cosmic hierarchies. Rather than attempting to claim obvious domains that would have brought him into direct competition with established powers, he focused on areas that had been neglected or poorly understood by existing deities, creating new categories of divine influence that complemented rather than directly challenged traditional portfolios. The worship that began to flow to him from mortal agents who finally understood the true nature of their relationship to his plans provided the spiritual energy necessary to stabilize his divine transformation, while creating networks of influence that extended throughout multiple planes of existence. These followers were not conventional cultists seeking power or immortality, but individuals whose involvement in his schemes had created bonds of responsibility and complicity that made genuine devotion their only psychologically sustainable option. The strategic withdrawal that concluded his initial bid for cosmic dominance was designed to provide time for consolidation and preparation for future operations, rather than representing genuine defeat or permanent setback. The enemies who believed they had successfully thwarted his ambitions failed to recognize that his true victory lay not in immediate triumph, but in fundamental changes to his nature and circumstances that made future success increasingly probable. The divine realm he established as his base of operations reflected the lessons learned from his previous empire and his centuries of imprisonment, incorporating defensive measures and escape mechanisms that would prevent future containment, while providing platforms for influence that transcended anything he had previously achieved. The domain was designed to exist simultaneously in multiple planes while remaining immune to the types of intervention that had originally led to his captivity. The followers who gathered around his new divine presence included not merely mortal worshippers, but undead entities, extraplanar beings, and even former enemies whose opposition had been transformed into grudging respect through recognition of his achievements. This diverse congregation provided him with capabilities and perspectives that no single category of servant could have offered, while their competing loyalties and conflicting agendas created internal tensions that prevented any individual or faction from accumulating sufficient power to threaten his authority. The knowledge that his partial success had demonstrated the possibility of transcending traditional limitations on divine ascension sent ripples throughout the cosmic community, inspiring other ambitious beings, while alarming established powers who recognized the implications for the stability of their own positions. The precedent he had established could not be easily undone or contained, creating possibilities for future developments that threatened to fundamentally alter the nature of divine existence itself. The cosmic order that emerged from his escape and initial ascension was subtly but significantly different from what had existed before, with new possibilities for transcendence and transformation available to beings with sufficient knowledge and determination to exploit them. The multiverse had been changed by his achievement in ways that would continue to influence the development of reality long after his immediate goals had been forgotten, creating opportunities and threats that even he could not fully anticipate or control. The victory he had achieved was incomplete but irreversible, establishing him as a permanent fixture in the divine hierarchy, while providing the foundation for future operations that would eventually threaten the stability of existence itself. The die had been cast, and the patterns it created in falling would continue to influence the shape of cosmic events for eons, beyond the immediate consequences of his transformation from prisoner to god. The divine existence that Vecna claimed through his escape from the domains of dread represented a form of godhood fundamentally different from the traditional ascensions that had elevated mortals to cosmic significance throughout the Pele's history of the multiverse, where conventional deities achieved their status through heroic achievements, mystical transcendence, or the accumulation of worship over centuries of devoted service. Vecna had carved his path to divinity through knowledge hoarded in darkness and power seized through manipulation of cosmic principles that most beings never recognized existed. The portfolio he established for himself during those initial moments of divine transformation reflected both strategic calculation and deep understanding of how divine authority functioned within the complex hierarchies that governed supernatural existence. Rather than claiming obvious domains that would have brought him into immediate conflict with established powers, he focused on aspects of reality that had been neglected or poorly understood by existing deities, creating new categories of divine influence that filled gaps in the cosmic order while avoiding direct challenges to entrenched authorities. The secrets that formed the core of his divine identity were not the simple mysteries that mortal minds typically associated with hidden knowledge, but fundamental truths about the nature of existence itself that had been deliberately concealed from conscious awareness to prevent the kind of cosmic disruption that widespread understanding would inevitably create. These were the principles underlying reality's construction, the mechanisms through which divine authority was established and maintained, the vulnerabilities inherent in systems that claimed to be eternal and unchangeable, the undeath that remained central to his divine nature, transformed from personal curse or limitation into cosmic principle, elevating the rejection of natural cycles from individual rebellion against mortality to universal force that challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which reality had been constructed. Where other deities of death worked within established frameworks that accepted the necessity of endings and beginnings, Vecna represented the possibility of transcending such cycles entirely through sufficient application of knowledge and will. The divine realm he established as his seat of power reflected lessons learned from centuries of empire building, dimensional imprisonment, and careful observation of how other cosmic entities structured their domains and relationships. This was not merely a place of residence, but a carefully engineered environment designed to maximize his capabilities while providing absolute security against the types of intervention that had previously disrupted his plans and achievements. The architecture of this realm defied conventional understanding of space and dimension, incorporating principles that allowed simultaneous existence across multiple planes while maintaining perfect coherence and accessibility to its primary inhabitant. The libraries contain not merely books and scrolls, but crystallized fragments of consciousness itself, preserving knowledge in forms that transcended written language to encompass direct transfer of understanding and experience between minds capable of receiving such communication. The followers who were drawn to worship him represented a fundamentally different category of divine servants from the conventional congregations that sustained other deities through prayer and sacrifice. These were not desperate supplicants seeking divine intervention in their personal struggles, nor devout believers motivated by faith in higher purposes, but individuals whose own pursuit of forbidden knowledge had led them to recognize the value of what he offered and the price that such revelation demanded. The cults that formed around his divine presence operated according to principles that challenged traditional religious structures while creating new models for the relationship between mortal worshippers and supernatural entities. Rather than emphasizing blind obedience or emotional devotion, these organizations functioned as academic institutions where advanced students could access increasingly dangerous forms of knowledge while proving their worthiness through demonstrations of competence and commitment rather than simple piety or submission. The rituals performed in his honor were designed not to provide comfort or spiritual fulfillment to participants, but to facilitate actual transmission of power and knowledge that transformed those who received such gifts into fundamentally different categories of beings. The ceremonies served as educational experiences that prepared initiates for responsibilities and capabilities that conventional religious practices could never address, while simultaneously strengthening the bonds that connected his consciousness to the growing network of entities who served his purposes throughout the multiverse. The influence he wielded over mortal affairs through these cultists and other agents operated according to methods that had been refined through centuries of practice and strategic thinking, emphasizing subtle manipulation over obvious intervention, while ensuring that his fingerprints remained invisible to all but the most sophisticated observers. The changes he inspired in mortal societies appeared to arise from natural social evolution rather than supernatural interference, making them difficult to detect or counter through conventional means. The political systems that gradually aligned themselves with his agenda did so through processes that seemed to reflect normal historical development rather than external manipulation. As leaders and institutions discovered that policies supporting his interests also served their own immediate practical needs, The economic structures that channeled resources toward his operations appeared to represent rational responses to market forces rather than divinely orchestrated wealth transfers, while the educational reforms that promoted his preferred forms of knowledge seemed to emerge from scholarly recognition of their obvious value rather than religious indoctrination. The relationships he maintained with other deities during this period demonstrated both diplomatic sophistication and strategic patience that reflected his understanding of cosmic politics and the limitations that constrained divine action, even at the highest levels of power. Rather than attempting immediate challenges to established authorities that would have united opposition against him, he focused on identifying areas where cooperation served mutual interests, while gradually expanding his own portfolio and influence through methods that appeared beneficial rather than threatening to potential allies. The negotiations he conducted with entities whose domains overlapped or complemented his own were masterworks of supernatural diplomacy, creating agreements that provided immediate benefits to all parties while establishing precedents and relationships that could be leveraged for future operations, requiring broader cooperation. These treaties and accords appeared to grant him less than he sought, while actually providing him with exactly what he needed to advance longer-term objectives that his negotiating partners never fully understood. The wars he avoided through such diplomatic maneuvering were conflicts that would have consumed resources and attention, better devoted to consolidating his divine transformation, while building the foundations for future expansion. The enemies he neutralized through negotiation rather than violence became potential allies whose opposition was diffused without creating martyrs or inspiring resistance movements that might have complicated his subsequent operations. The knowledge that continued to flow to him from mortal agents and supernatural allies throughout the multiverse represented perhaps his most significant advantage over other divine entities, providing him with information about developments and opportunities that even the most well-informed deities typically learned about only after events had already been shaped by forces they had failed to anticipate. This intelligence network operated through channels that appeared to serve legitimate research and scholarly exchange rather than espionage or political manipulation. The innovations he introduced to magical theory through controlled revelation to select scholars created ripple effects throughout academic communities that gradually shifted the entire discipline toward approaches more compatible with his own methods and objectives. These changes appeared to represent natural intellectual progress rather than deliberate indoctrination, making them difficult to identify or resist, while ensuring that future generations of magical practitioners would be trained in techniques that served his purposes, whether they recognized his influence or not. The undead creatures that served as his most reliable agents throughout the planes represented innovations in necromantic science that transcended anything previously achieved by conventional death magic, combining the loyalty and persistence of traditional undead with intelligence and creativity that allowed them to function effectively in complex social and political environments. These entities could pass for living beings when necessary, while possessing capabilities that no mortal agent could match for sustained operations requiring decades or centuries of patient work. The philosophical impact of his divine existence upon cosmic understanding of the nature of godhood itself created intellectual ferment that extended far beyond religious or magical communities to encompass fundamental questions about consciousness, authority, and the relationship between knowledge and power. The precedent he had established through his ascension challenged assumptions that had been taken for granted throughout recorded history, opening possibilities for transformation and transcendence that other ambitious beings had never previously imagined. The theological debates that emerged in response to his achievement revealed deep fractures within established religious systems that had previously been able to maintain coherent explanations for divine authority and cosmic order. The existence of a deity whose portfolio explicitly included the transcendence of traditional limitations forced scholars and clergy to grapple with questions that their inherited frameworks were not equipped to address adequately. The fear that his success inspired among other cosmic entities was not the simple concern about competition or territorial disputes that typically characterize divine conflicts, but existential anxiety about the stability of the entire system within which they operated. His very existence as a god who had achieved divinity through rejection of the principles that constrained other deities created uncertainties about the permanence and reliability of cosmic structures that had previously seemed eternal and unchangeable. The opportunities that his ascension created for other ambitious beings represented perhaps his most significant long-term impact upon the multiverse. As entities throughout the planes began to recognize that limitations previously considered absolute could be transcended through sufficient knowledge and determination. The techniques he had pioneered for achieving divine transformation could not be easily replicated, but the proof that such transformation was possible inspired innovations and experiments that threatened to fundamentally alter the nature of cosmic society. The balance of power that emerged from his integration into divine hierarchies was subtly but significantly different from what had existed before, creating new possibilities for alliance and conflict while establishing precedents that would influence the development of cosmic politics for eons beyond his immediate goals. The multiverse had been changed by his achievement in ways that continued to generate consequences long after the immediate drama of his ascension had been forgotten by all but the most dedicated scholars of divine history. The legacy he was building through his divine existence extended far beyond personal ambition or individual achievement to encompass fundamental changes in how conscious beings throughout the multiverse understood the nature of possibility itself. The whispered god had become not merely another entry in cosmic hierarchies, but a force for transformation that challenged the stability of existence while opening doorways to futures that even his own considerable imagination could not fully anticipate or control. The secrets he continued to gather through his divine agents and supernatural allies represented raw materials for future operations that would eventually threaten not merely individual enemies or competing powers, but the fundamental assumptions upon which reality itself had been constructed. The knowledge was accumulating like potential energy in carefully designed systems, waiting for the proper moment to be released in ways that would reshape existence according to principles that transcended anything previously achieved by mortal or divine consciousness. The eternal nature of his current existence provided the time necessary to plan and execute operations that dwarfed anything possible during his mortal lifetime, while his divine capabilities offered tools and resources that made previously impossible objectives suddenly achievable through patient application of superior knowledge and strategic thinking. The god who had once been a traumatized child watching his mother burn had become something that threatened to burn away the very foundations of cosmic order in pursuit of truths that would remake existence itself. The figure that Vecna had become through his journey from mortal child to divine entity represents far more than the simple accumulation of power and knowledge that his surface achievements might suggest to casual observers. His transformation embodies fundamental questions about the nature of evil itself, the relationship between trauma and choice, the price of transcendence, and the ultimate consequences of pursuing knowledge without wisdom or power without restraint. To understand what he has become requires looking beyond the catalogue of his crimes and achievements to examine the deeper patterns that connect his earliest experiences to his ultimate cosmic significance. The child who watched his mother burn in the flames of ignorance and prejudice carried within him potentials that could have developed in radically different directions depending on the choices he made and the influences he encountered during his formative years. The trauma that shaped his early consciousness created wounds that demanded healing, but the path he chose led toward the accumulation of power sufficient to ensure that he would never again be vulnerable to the arbitrary cruelty of those who confused authority with righteousness. This choice, while understandable in its psychological origins, established patterns that would eventually consume not merely his own humanity but threaten the stability of existence itself. The transformation from victim to victimizer that defines his character arc represents one of the most disturbing aspects of his story, demonstrating how suffering that is not processed and integrated through healthy means can metastasize into forms of evil that dwarf the original injustice in scope and horror. The magistrate who had once believed in justice chose to abandon those ideals rather than work to reform systems that had failed him, opting instead to create new forms of tyranny that would subject countless innocents to experiences far worse than anything he had personally endured. The knowledge that he pursued with such single-minded dedication throughout his existence serves simultaneously as his greatest achievement and his most fundamental corruption, illustrating the dual nature of information as both liberating force and dangerous weapon, depending on how it is acquired, understood, and applied. The secrets he hoarded were not mere academic curiosities or practical techniques, but truths about the fundamental nature of existence that carried within them the power to reshape reality according to the will of those who possessed sufficient understanding and ruthlessness to exploit such insights. The philosophical questions raised by his pursuit of forbidden knowledge extend far beyond issues of magical theory or supernatural politics to encompass fundamental concerns about the relationship between consciousness and responsibility, individual agency, and cosmic order, the value of wisdom versus the appeal of pure intellectual achievement. His story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of divorcing learning from ethics, of treating knowledge as an end in itself, rather than a tool for promoting flourishing and reducing suffering throughout the cosmos. The undeath that he embraced as a solution to the limitations of mortality represents perhaps his most symbolic rejection of the natural order and the cycles of change that give life its meaning and beauty. By choosing to exist outside the processes of birth, growth, decline, and renewal that define organic existence, he cut himself off from sources of wisdom and connection that could only be accessed through acceptance of vulnerability and impermanence. The immortality he achieved preserved his consciousness, while isolating it from the experiences that make consciousness worth preserving. The empire he built during his centuries of mortal rule demonstrated both his extraordinary capabilities and the ultimate sterility of systems based purely on domination and fear rather than cooperation and mutual benefit. The efficiency and scope of his achievements during this period cannot be denied, yet they produce no lasting value beyond the accumulation of power for its own sake, creating monuments to tyranny that enriched no one except their architect while impoverishing the world through their very existence. The betrayal by Kaz that ended his first bid for ultimate power illustrates the inevitable instability of relationships based on hierarchy and control, rather than genuine trust and shared values. The lieutenant who turned against him was responding not merely to personal ambition but to the fundamental contradiction inherent in systems that demand absolute loyalty, while providing no mechanism for addressing legitimate grievances or evolving beyond the limitations of their original design. The imprisonment in the domains of dread that followed his apparent destruction provided him with opportunities for reflection and growth that he might never have encountered during the constant activity of ruling an empire. Yet the lessons he drew from this experience focused on tactical improvements and strategic refinements rather than fundamental reconsideration of his goals and methods. The centuries of isolation strengthened his commitment to transcendence while deepening his disconnection from the values and relationships that might have provided alternatives to his chosen path. The divine ascension that represented the culmination of his cosmic ambitions achieved everything he had sought while simultaneously demonstrating the essential emptiness of goals based purely on the accumulation of power and the transcendence of limitations. The godhood he claimed granted him capabilities that exceeded anything he had previously imagined possible, yet left him fundamentally unchanged in terms of the psychological and spiritual wounds that had originally motivated his pursuit of such achievements. The influence he continues to wield throughout the multiverse through his divine agents and cultist followers represents perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his legacy, as it demonstrates how individual trauma and poor choices can create ripple effects that continue to generate suffering long after their original causes have been forgotten. The knowledge he spreads through his servants carries within it the same patterns of corruption that shaped his own development, creating new generations of beings who choose power over wisdom, dominance over cooperation, isolation over connection. The cycles of influence that his story has created within the broader context of planar civilization illustrate how evil perpetuates itself, not through direct coercion, but through the establishment of cultural and intellectual frameworks that make destructive choices appear reasonable or even necessary to those who operate within such systems. The precedents he has established for transcending divine limitations inspire other ambitious beings, while the methods he pioneered for achieving such transcendence corrupt everyone who attempts to replicate his achievements. The question of whether he can ever be truly defeated extends beyond tactical considerations about his current capabilities to encompass deeper issues about the nature of ideas and their persistence within conscious systems. Even if his physical manifestation were somehow destroyed and his divine status revoked, the knowledge he has spread and the patterns he has established would continue to influence the development of magical theory, political systems, and individual psychology throughout the multiverse for eons beyond his personal existence. The theoretical endpoints for his story range from scenarios in which he achieves ultimate cosmic dominance through patient accumulation of power and knowledge, to possibilities in which he undergoes fundamental transformation through encounters with forces or perspectives that challenge his basic assumptions about the nature of existence and value. Neither outcome seems particularly likely given the consistency of his character development over millennia of existence. Yet both remain theoretically possible within the framework of a multiverse that allows for radical change and unexpected developments. The impact he has had upon the development of fantasy literature and gaming culture extends far beyond his role as a memorable antagonist to encompass his function as an archetype of the brilliant individual whose capabilities are corrupted by trauma and misdirected toward destructive ends. His story resonates with audiences because it illustrates patterns that appear throughout human history and personal experience, making him simultaneously alien in his supernatural achievements and familiar in his psychological motivations and moral failures. The appeal of his character as a subject for storytelling and gaming lies partly in the scope of his ambitions and achievements, which provide opportunities for epic narratives and cosmic conflicts, but perhaps more significantly in the way his story illuminates fundamental questions about choice, responsibility, and the relationship between individual psychology and broader social and cosmic order. He serves as a mirror that reflects both the potential for transcendence that exists within conscious beings and the dangers that arise when such potential is pursued without adequate attention to ethical considerations and social responsibility. The timeless quality of his archetype ensures that versions of his story will continue to be told and retold in various forms and contexts, each adaptation reflecting the specific concerns and perspectives of its creators, while preserving the essential elements that make his character compelling and disturbing. The magistrate who watched his mother burn and chose revenge over healing will continue to serve as a cautionary tale about the consequences of allowing trauma to define our relationship to the world and our understanding of what makes existence meaningful. The ultimate significance of his story may lie not in the particular supernatural achievements that mark his fictional career, but in what those achievements represent about the human condition and the choices that conscious beings face when confronted with suffering, injustice, and the apparent meaninglessness of existence. He embodies one possible response to cosmic indifference and personal trauma, demonstrating both the heights of achievement that individual will can reach and the depths of corruption that such achievement can entail when pursued without wisdom or compassion. The eternal secret that he represents is not the forbidden knowledge that he hoards, or the cosmic truths that he has discovered through centuries of research and experimentation, but the recognition that power without purpose, knowledge without wisdom, and transcendence without connection ultimately lead to forms of existence that preserve consciousness while destroying everything that makes consciousness valuable. His story serves as both warning and invitation, challenging audiences to consider what they would choose when faced with similar circumstances, while providing hope that alternative paths exist for those willing to seek healing rather than dominance, connection rather than control, wisdom rather than mere knowledge. The legacy he leaves behind is not the empire he built or the secrets he discovered, but the demonstration that even the most extraordinary achievements become hollow when they are pursued for their own sake, rather than in service of values that transcend individual ambition. His immortal existence serves as a monument to the futility of seeking meaning through the accumulation of power, while simultaneously illustrating the tragic waste that occurs when exceptional capabilities are directed toward destructive rather than constructive ends. In the end, the whispered god, who began as a frightened child watching his mother's execution, has become exactly what those flames were meant to prevent, a force of chaos and corruption that threatens the stability of existence itself. Yet he remains recognizably human in his fundamental motivations and psychological patterns. His story reminds us that the greatest evils often arise not from alien malevolence or incomprehensible cosmic forces, but from the familiar human tendency to respond to pain with the infliction of greater pain, to trauma with the creation of new trauma, to injustice with the establishment of greater injustices that perpetuate cycles of suffering across generations and species and planes of existence. And so we reach the end of Vecna's chronicle, though for the Whispered One, there are no true endings, only pauses between schemes. His tale reminds us that evil is rarely born in isolation, but grows from seeds of injustice, trauma, and the desire for control over an uncontrollable world. From the flames that consumed his mother to the divine throne he claimed through betrayal and sacrifice, Vecna's story is one of transformation, but not redemption. He chose power over healing, dominion over connection, secrets over truth. In the quiet darkness where you now rest, remember that knowledge itself is neither good nor evil, but what we choose to do with it defines us. Some secrets are meant to be shared, some burdens lightened through trust. As sleep takes you, let go of the day's small betrayals and disappointments. Unlike Vecna, you need not carry them into eternity. Rest now in the peace that comes from knowing that even the mightiest tyrants are, in the end, simply people who forgot how to be vulnerable. Sweet dreams, and may your rest be free from whispered secrets in the dark.